daily food, and hunger in the time of Jesus. What did a poor family in first-century Galilee actually eat on an ordinary day? Not at a festival, not at a wedding, on a Tuesday. When there was work to be done and mouths to feed, and the harvest from last season was running lower than they had hoped. And why does understanding the answer to that question transform some of the most familiar sayings and miracles in the entire Gospel record, from the multiplication of the loaves and fish, to the request for daily bread in the Lord's Prayer, to Jesus' references to sparrows and lily and salt, to the parable of the prodigal son's hunger in the pig pen? Most readers of the Gospels bring to the text an unconscious assumption about food, that it exists, that it can be obtained, that hunger is temporary and exceptional. For the majority of people in first-century Judea and Galilee, that assumption was wrong. Hunger was not exceptional. Food insecurity was the normal condition of a large proportion of the population. The meal was not guaranteed, and every prayer for daily bread was a prayer with genuine urgency behind it. Understanding the food culture of first-century Judea, what people grew, what they actually, how they prepared it, what they did when it ran out, and what it meant theologically when Jesus fed 5,000 people in a deserted place with 5 loaves and to fish, does not reduce the miracle. It amplifies it, because in a world where food was precious and precarious, the abundance of that meal was not just impressive. It was a sign of the kingdom. To understand what people ate in the time of Jesus, we must first understand how food was produced in first-century Judea and Galilee, because in a pre-industrial, pre-refrigeration, pre-global trade world, what people ate was almost entirely determined by what they could grow or raise in their immediate environment, what they could afford to buy at local markets, and what the season and climate had provided. The agricultural landscape of first-century Galilee and Judea was organized around 3 primary crops that had sustained the population of the eastern Mediterranean for millennia: grain, primarily wheat, and barley, olives, and grapes. These 3, together with legumes, principally lentils, chickpeas, and fava beans, constant for virtually everyone who was not wealthy enough to eat differently. Wheat was the preferred grain used to make the finer bread that was a marker of slightly higher social status. But barley was more common among the poor. Barley grew with less water and less fertile soil than wheat, was cheaper to buy and more accessible to grow on marginal land, produced bread that was coarser, heavier, and less prestigious than wheat bread. The 5 loaves in the feeding of the 5,000 in John 6 are specifically described as barley loaves. The detail places the disciples' food supply firmly in the category of peasant provisions. Olives were processed into olive oil, which served simultaneously as cooking fat, condiment, lamp fuel, medicine, and trade commodity. The olive harvest in October and November was one of the most labor-intensive periods of the agricultural year. Entire families and hired workers gathered to beat the olive trees with sticks, collect the fallen fruit, and press it in stone olive presses that still the archaeological landscape of the region. Olive oil could be stored for months and was a reliable source of caloric density and nutritional fat through the winter. Grapes, grown on terraced hillsides throughout Judea and Galilee, were eaten fresh in season, preserved as raisins, and most importantly, pressed into wine. Wine was not a luxury in first-century Judea. It was the primary beverage of the population. Because it was safer than water, the fermentation process killed many of the pathogens present in water sources, more caloric, and produced by a process that allowed grapes harvested in September to provide nutrition through the winter and beyond. Bread was not one item on a menu. In first-century Judea, bread was the meal. The word for bread, in Aramaic lahma, in Greek artos, was used interchangeably in many contexts with the word for food itself. To eat was to have food. To lack bread was to be hungry. The cultural and symbolic weight of bread in the tradition of Israel was so enormous precisely because the physical reality of bread was so central to survival. The production of bread began not in an oven but in a field. The grain had to be grown, harvested, stored, threshed separating the grain from the chaff. Winnowed using the wind to separate the lighter chaff from the heavier grain, and stored in sealed containers or granaries to protect it from rodents and moisture. This entire process, from field to storage, occupied a significant portion of the agricultural year and required significant labor from the whole family. From storage, grain had to be ground into flour. In the absence of water mills which existed but were not universal in rural areas, grain was ground by hand on stone saddle querns or rotary querns, a labor-intensive task performed primarily by women. Typically, in the early morning, the grinding of grain was a daily task in most households. Because flour did not keep well once ground, it went stale and became susceptible to insect infestation relatively quickly. The sound of grinding stones was the sound of a village waking up. Flour mixed with water and leavened with a portion of dough saved from a previous baking was shaped into flat rounds and baked either on a flat stone heated by fire, heated from dough, or in communal ovens in larger settlements. The result was not the uniform, sliced bread of a modern bakery. It was dense, chewy, slightly sour from the natural fermentation, and varied enormously in quality depending on the ratio of wheat to barley. The fineness of the grinding and the conditions of the baking, this bread was torn, not sliced or cut. It was dipped in olive oil, in garum, a fish sauce condiment common throughout the Roman world. In vegetable stews, in the juices of legumes, it was the vehicle for everything else eaten at a meal, the plate and the food simultaneously. When Jesus took bread at the Last Supper, broke it, and said, "This is my body," he was handling the most fundamental, most elemental food in the world of his listeners, the thing without which life literally could not continue. For the poor majority of the population, peasant farmers, day laborers, fishermen, artisans, the daily diet was simple, limited, and insufficient by modern nutritional standards. It was also monotonous in ways that are difficult for people with access to the variety of a modern supermarket to fully appreciate. The typical meal of a poor Galilean family centered on bread, legumes, and whatever vegetables and condiments were available in the current season. Lentils, one of the oldest cultivated legumes in the world, and the stuff of Esau's famous bargain in Genesis 25 were the most common protein source. A thick lentil soup or stew, seasoned with onions, garlic, cumin, and coriander, eaten with bread. This was not occasional food for the poor. It was daily food. For many families, it was the meal every day for most of the year. Peas, fava beans, and other legumes provided variety and additional protein. Vegetables, seasonal and local, cucumbers, leeks, onions, garlic, bitter herbs, were eaten when they were available. Fish, for those living near the Sea of Galilee or the Mediterranean coast, provided an important protein supplement, whether fresh when available or, more importantly for preservation, salted and dried. The fishing industry of the Sea of Galilee was not producing fresh fish for upscale restaurants. It was producing salted fish for distribution throughout the region, providing accessible protein at affordable prices for populations far from fresh fish sources. Meat from sheep, goats, or cattle was not a regular part of the poor family's diet. It was festival food, celebration food, hospitality food for honored guests. The fatted calf in the parable of the prodigal son was not a routine meal. It was the signal of an extraordinary celebration, which is exactly what made it the appropriate response to the son's return. The father was not simply making dinner. He was marking an event of such significance that the household's most valuable protein reserve was sacrificed for it. If this exploration of food and poverty in the time of Jesus is helping you read the Gospels with new depth, take a moment to support this content. Like the video so more people can discover these historical details. Subscribe to the channel and tell me, from what city and country are you watching? I love reading every comment. The staple foods of first century Judea were made palatable and culturally rich by a set of condiments and additions that appear Throughout the gospel text in both their literal and symbolic dimensions, salt was among the most valuable commodities in the ancient world, so valuable that Roman soldiers were sometimes paid partly in salt, the origin of the word salary from the Latin sal, salt. In a world without refrigeration, salt was the primary preservative for meat, fish, olives, and vegetables, making it possible to store food beyond its natural season. It was also a flavor enhancer, a purification agent, and a covenant symbol. Salt was required to accompany every offering made at the temple. Jesus' reference to his disciples as the salt of the earth in Matthew 5:13 was not a vague compliment. In the material world of his listeners, salt was essential, irreplaceable, and transformative. Without salt, fish rotted instead of being preserved. Without salt, meat could not be stored through the winter. Without salt, bread was flavorless. You are the salt of the earth meant you are what makes preservation and flavor possible. And then the warning, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet, salt that had been contaminated or absorbed. Moisture lost its effectiveness, a real agricultural reality in a humid climate, not a theoretical impossibility. Olive oil, as mentioned in the discussion of agriculture, was the universal cooking fat, condiment, and lamp fuel. The oil and wine that the Good Samaritan poured into the wounds of the injured man were not exotic medical supplies. They were the two most common liquids in the region, available in any ordinary household. The 5 wise virgins with oil in their lamps were prepared with the most ordinary of provisions. The lamp that gives light to the whole house in Matthew 5:15 burned on the most common fuel of the ancient world. Garum, the fermented fish sauce that was the ketchup of the Roman world, was produced throughout the Mediterranean and traded widely. Evidence of garum production has been found archaeologically throughout the Roman Empire. It was cheap, intensely flavorful, and provided both salt and protein in a liquid form that kept indefinitely. The peasant diet of first-century Judea was flavored with this condiment in ways that archaeology continues to document. Beneath the discussion of what was available to eat in first-century Judea lies a harder question. How often did people not have enough? The answer, for a significant portion of the population, is often. Chronic food insecurity, not having enough to eat, or not knowing whether you would have enough to eat, was a structural condition of peasant life in the ancient Mediterranean. The reasons were multiple and reinforcing. Farming in the region was dependent on seasonal rainfall that was itself variable and unpredictable. A dry winter meant a reduced grain harvest in the spring. A late frost or an early hot wind at the wrong moment could damage the crop significantly. Locust swarms, referenced in multiple places in the Bible and documented throughout the region's history, could strip a field overnight. Any of these events, alone or in combination, could reduce a family's harvest below the level needed to cover both their subsistence and their tax obligations. When the harvest was insufficient, the options were grim. Families could reduce their consumption, eating less, eating lower quality food, substituting bitter herbs and forage plants for the grain that was running low. They could borrow from wealthier neighbors or local creditors, incurring debt that, in the absence of a subsequent good harvest, could spiral toward the loss of land. They could sell family members into indentured service. In extreme cases, they could abandon their land and join the day laborer population, working for daily wages that provided no security and no accumulation. The parable of the day laborers in Matthew 20, who stand in the marketplace from early morning hoping to be hired, was not a sociological study. It was the description of a reality that Jesus' listeners knew from their own lives, or the lives of people they knew. The men hired at the 11th hour, who had stood idle all day because no one has hired us. Not lazy, they were experiencing the daily anxiety of poverty in an agricultural economy that did not guarantee work. No discussion of food in the time of Jesus can omit the event that all four Gospels record, the only miracle other than the resurrection. to appear in all four accounts. The feeding of the 5,000 with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. The setting is topos eremos topos in decembernes. A large crowd has followed Jesus, and as evening approaches, the disciples come to him with a practical concern. This is a desolate place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to go into the villages and buy food for themselves. The concern is entirely realistic. 5,000 men, plus women and children. Matthew specifies the 5,000 was the men alone, in a remote location, with no food supply at the end of the day. Jesus says, "You give them something to eat." The disciples' response, "We have only 5 loaves here, and 2 fish," is not an exaggeration of the impossibility. It is a realistic inventory. John's account specifies that a boy in the crowd had this provision: 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. Even distributed among a small group, this would have been a modest meal. For thousands of people, it was nothing. Jesus had the crowd sit on the grass in groups of 50 and 100, an organizational detail that reads as genuine memory. He took the loaves and fish, looked up to heaven, blessed, broke, and gave to the disciples to distribute. And they all ate and were satisfied, and 12 baskets of broken pieces were left over, more remaining than had been present at the beginning. In the world where this miracle occurred, a world where barley bread was the food of the poor, where fish was the protein of the laboring class, where hunger was a real and daily experience, where a crowd of ordinary Galileans had followed a teacher to a deserted place with no food supply. The abundance of this meal was not just impressive, it was a sign written in the language of the kingdom. The God who had fed Israel with manna in the wilderness was feeding his people again. The messianic banquet that the prophets had promised, the feast of rich food, the banquet of well-aged wine that Isaiah described in chapter 25, was breaking into ordinary Galilean reality through 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. Give us this day our daily bread. The petition seems simple, almost anticlimactic amid the theological profundity of the rest of the Lord's Prayer. But in its original context, addressed to people who literally did not always know if they would have enough to eat. It was anything but routine. The Greek word translated daily, epiousios, is actually one of the most debated words in the entire New Testament. It appears nowhere in Greek literature before the New Testament and has resisted confident translation for 2,000 years. The options include the bread we need for today, the bread for tomorrow, asking in advance for what will be needed, the supernatural bread anticipating the messianic banquet, or simply the essential bread, the bread that sustains life. All of these translations capture something real. What is not debatable is the practical weight of the petition in its original context, in a world where bread was the primary food, where its production depended on weather, harvest, and the vagaries of the agricultural economy, and where poverty was widespread. Asking God to provide this day's bread was not spiritual formality. It was acknowledgement of real dependence on a real God for real food. The petition also establishes something about the relationship between the spiritual and the material in Jesus's teaching. He does not pray, "Help us not to worry about food while we focus on spiritual things." He prays, "Give us food today, the specific food we need to sustain life today." The incarnation of God in Jesus was an embrace of physical reality, of hunger, of fatigue. The prayer he taught his disciples embedded this embrace in daily practice. The dietary life of first-century Jews was shaped not just by poverty and abundance, but by a religious calendar that built regular patterns of fasting and feasting into the structure of the year and the week. The Sabbath, the 7th day, from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday, was a day of rest that also had a distinctive character of celebration and abundance. The Talmud later codified the expectation that Sabbath meals should be more elaborate than weekday meals, more courses, better food, a sense of festivity that marked the day as different from the working week. Even poor families who ate simple food through the week tried to make the Sabbath meal something special. The annual calendar included multiple fast days, Most prominently, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, on which the entire community fasted from to sundown as part of the communal repentance and atonement ritual. The significance of this fast was not caloric but spiritual. The body's hunger was the physical expression of the community's acknowledgement of its need for God's forgiveness. Festivals, conversely, were marked by abundant eating. Passover required the consumption of specific foods: the Passover lamb, unleavened bread, bitter herbs, keroseta paste symbolizing the mortar of Egyptian slavery. In a ritualized meal that was simultaneously a theological education and a communal celebration. The 7 days of tabernacles involved communal meals in the Sukkot, temporary shelters built to recall the wilderness wandering of Israel. These festivals broke the monotony of ordinary diet and embedded the rhythms of God's story with Israel in the physical experience of eating and drinking together. The Gospels contain enough specific food references to give us a reasonable picture of what Jesus himself ate and how he related to food as part of ordinary life. He ate fish, the Sea of Galilee's most available protein, and the provision he distributed at the feeding of the thousands. The post-resurrection appearance in John 21, where Jesus has already prepared a charcoal fire with fish on it when the disciples arrive. And the appearance in Luke 24, where he eats a piece of broiled fish in the disciples' presence, both normalize fish as the expected food. He attended weddings and dinner parties and was criticized for it. Matthew 11:19 records the accusation, "The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, 'Look at him, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners.'" The accusation of gluttony and drinking was probably not literally true. It was a rhetorical attack. But it reflects the fact that Jesus was known for sharing meals, for accepting dinner invitations, for being present at tables where food and drink and conversation happened. He was not an ascetic. He observed Passover, the most elaborate meal of the Jewish calendar, with his disciples on the night before his arrest. The Last Supper was, at its foundation, a Passover meal: the unleavened bread, the wine, the bitter herbs, the retelling of the Exodus story. He took the bread and broke it, as the father of every Jewish household had done for centuries. He took the cup, and he reinterpreted both. "This is my body. This is my blood of the new covenant," transforming the memorial meal of the old covenant into the instituting meal of the new one. Tracing the food of the poor in first-century Judea brings us finally to a simple but profound recognition. Jesus was not born into a world of abundance. He was born into a world of scarcity, into a family that could afford a dove but not a lamb. In a region where peasant farmers watched the sky anxiously for rain, where day laborers stood in the marketplace hoping to be hired, where a woman could lose an entire day's wages and search her house frantically until she found it, he taught people who prayed for daily bread because they genuinely needed daily bread. He fed crowds who were hungry, not as a demonstration of power for people who were comfortable, but as an act of compassion for people who were tired and far from home and had nothing to eat. He told parables about farmers and fishermen and women baking bread and fathers killing fatted calves for returning sons, not because these were picturesque illustrations of abstract truths, but because they were the material of the world in which his listeners actually lived. And in all of this, in the barley bread and the salted fish, in the grinding stone and the clay oven, in the lentil stew and the bitter herbs, in the daily prayer for food that was not guaranteed, he was present, eating with them, walking the same hungry roads, subject to the same conditions of the body that they navigated every day. The one who is himself the bread of life was born in a world where bread was not always available. That is not incidental. It is the shape of grace. If this documentary helped you understand the food culture of first-century Judea and the way it illuminates the teachings and miracles of Jesus, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you receive every new study in this series. And before you go, tell me in the comments, which food reference in the Gospels means the most to you And does this historical context change how you understand it? I love reading your responses from every part of the world. May the bread of life satisfy your deepest hunger. Until our next documentary, among Jesus's parables of lostness, in Luke 15, the parable of the lost coin is the most domestic and the most economically specific, and reading it against the background of first century household economics makes it considerably more vivid than a casual reading suggests. What woman, having 10 silver coins, if she loses 1 coin, does not light a lamp and sweep the house and seek diligently until she finds it? And when she has found it, she calls together her friends and neighbors, saying, "Rejoice with me, for I have found the coin that I had lost." Just so, I tell you, there is joy before the angels of God over one sinner who repents. The 10 silver coins, 10 drachmas, each worth approximately a day's wage for a common laborer, were likely not simply loose change. 10 coins of silver in a poor household may well have constituted a significant portion of the family's savings, money set aside for taxes, for emergency, for a daughter's dowry, for a son's wedding expenses. The loss of 1 in 10 was not trivial. It was a real loss that warranted a real search. Search is specific. She lights a lamp because the stone-floored, small-windowed house was dark even in daylight, and sweeps the floor, working systematically through the dim interior looking for the coin that might be anywhere, among the gaps in the stone floor or the accumulated debris of daily life. The diligence of the search reflects the value of what was lost. This is not a woman searching for something she can easily replace. This is a woman searching for something whose loss she cannot simply absorb. When she finds it, she calls her neighbors and friends to celebrate. The joy is communal, shared, expressed, celebrated together. This is the texture of village life. The woman's loss was known to her community, and her ending would be shared with them. The community of sorrow was also the community of joy. And in this domestic, economic, intensely ordinary scene, Jesus places the image of heaven's response to one person who repents, the same diligent searching, the same overwhelming relief and joy, the same communal celebration. The God of the universe keeps house like a poor woman searching for a lost coin.